Hello everyone. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about some helpful ways to understand mental illness. And I oftentimes relate this to the why and the what paradigm. And it's important to know why you're doing certain things in order to get the maximum benefit. For example, it's important to know why you're journaling, why you're breathing, why you're connecting to yourself and others. Otherwise, you give it a try and it doesn't give you the results you want and you stop. But when you understand a bit more about why, then you can stay with it because you understand that it takes time and why it might take time to give you that extra staying power to get the benefit. So this is one way to understand how addiction, mental health, and all of these coping things, self-defeating habits all tie together. And I think the first thing that they start with is what I call stuff. You have to understand that long before things come to need a therapist or anything like that, much of this has already occurred. So what I collectively call stuff really is a combination of trauma. Trauma is the bad things that happen to you, right? So let's just call these the bad things. Things that just couldn't process in the time when they happened. And then there's what we call attachment issues. Attachment issues is best understood as inadequate nurturance. So children have not many needs, but the needs they have are deep. Child needs to know that they're loved, needs to be reassured that things are going to be okay all the time, frequently. Even if the needs were met 90% of the time, the 10% leaves a deep wound. And so you get the wounds of omission. Oftentimes, these two things go together, not always, but most of the time. If things were really bad, you tend to get what we call complex trauma. And I think there's a lot of this in society these days. And it's important to understand that no one's immune to this. Immigrants have complex trauma. People born with parents who suffer from addiction or mental health issues, physical health issues even, suffer complex trauma. And so the idea is that stuff, so let's underline it here, stuff happens, okay? And after stuff happens, it sends a wave into the future. Most of the time, people don't deal with stuff at the time, especially not kids, because it oftentimes goes unrecognized because kids are very resilient. And so there's this idea that time heals all wounds, and unfortunately, time does not heal all wounds. Time gives you an opportunity to heal or to scar. And healing is an active process. You know when you're healing, you're doing the work, you're seeing the therapist, you're doing all that stuff you need to do. So most people with time, they scar. And scar, over time, creates what we call emotional dysregulation. So, for example, if a child has been told that they shouldn't cry, they should, as a sad thing, it's often said in society, is man up, or girls don't cry, or other silly things like that. A child takes that seriously. Moreover, if a child will learn from what the parents do, not so much what they say. And so they develop emotional dysregulation, and this shows up in people's lives oftentimes with diagnoses like, anxiety, depression. If there's a lot of trauma, you can get things like PTSD, and people have symptoms like sleep problems, burnout, right? Is a common one amongst healthcare professionals, especially in these COVID days. So the point is, as emotional dysregulation occurs, and again, long before people ever see anyone like me, more time has passed. People have lived with this. And as I said, time creates scar. And as a result, people will do one of two things. They'll either cope or they won't. And so, if you have emotional dysregulation, you're not comfortable in your skill, and you're not coping with that in any way, healthy or unhealthy, well, now life is really not manageable. And when any human feels life is not manageable, they start looking at this. As we know, about 30, I believe the data is 50 men and about 30 women in Canada suicide every week. It's very common. Everyone's been touched by suicide, and that's why. Absence of coping gives you only one way out, which is suicide. And most people don't choose that. Most people, they cope. Some people cope healthily. Some people cope unhealthily. And what everyone uses is what I call the people, places, and things to get by, right? So some people, they get into relationships. They're struggling emotionally, and they get into relationships with people who are struggling, but perhaps in a different way. They develop, a codependency. Some people get into, traveling. And they're always traveling, always busy. They never like to sit with themselves. Running here, workaholism, and of course things. People can cope with all sorts of things, and the things that oftentimes people get in trouble with are things like alcohol, drugs, behaviors like gambling, food. We even have a word in society, comfort food. Heard that before. So you get eating disorders, which oftentimes stem from a lot of issues with attachment, with parental figures early on in life. You can get, internet addiction, sex addiction, workaholism. Even healthy behaviors like exercise can become a source of unhealthy coping. Because the nature of coping is that it distracts away from self. So unhealthy coping I define as distracts away from self. Healthy coping deals and repairs and builds self. And that's the third way. Which we call recovery. Let's make that nice and yellow with stars, because it's beautiful. But coming back to unhealthy coping, the truth is everyone copes. Everyone has to cope. I remember when I've had difficult call shifts, when I've been on call and bad things happen, people dying, or just horrible situations. On the way home, you stop by McDonald's. You have an ice cream, even though it's probably not healthy. And when you trace all of this back, a lot of these things that predispose us to stress come from stuff. The stuff is really, really important. Because it weighs you down. And here's an interesting thing that happens with stuff. The brain tends to become leaky over time. So the smell of the past, people always tell me, in recovery, it's like, Dr. Gill, I don't want to deal with it. I'm looking forward. I'm not looking back. The past is the past. That's what they say. And they say I'm done with the past. And which is great, I liken the past to a Roman handshake. I can't draw very well, but you have a Roman handshake and your hands are on the other person's forearm and their hand is on your forearm. And just because one part lets go doesn't mean the other part lets go. So just because you're done with the past may not be done with you. And how does it look in the brain? If we were to draw the brain, and what you see, this is not a strictly anatomical version of the brain, but what you see is that the brain over time has delicately, in gentle ways, constructed an architecture so sophisticated to wall off the past. Let's say you have dad issues, some mom issues, some abuse that happened, bullying, school, and, an assault that you haven't dealt with. Well, what happens over time is these circuits, the brain's capacity to wall things off, which is kind of what we call dissociation, they become permeable over time. Why is that? It's because the brain ages. And as the brain ages, it ages like any organ. You may not know, but when newborns die and an autopsy is performed, and even if they didn't die of a cardiac or a heart cause, if you dissect their blood vessels of their heart, newborns, right? not even a day old, you see atherosclerosis. You see fatty streak, the beginning of blocking of the arteries. 70, 80 years later, that turn into full clogs. Starts at birth, because we're not built to be immortal. Who would want to be immortal? Sounds like a horrible thing. We're built to be here for a couple of decades, and then we're built to go. And so all of our organs naturally age, and the brain is no different. So over time, you get a breakdown of these. Sometimes people get concussions. If you imagine taking a skyscraper and, beautiful skyscraper, and you just like kind of shake it from the outside a little bit, like a little earthquake. It may still be standing, but you can be guaranteed inside it's going to be a horrible mess. And so some people get concussions, and they oftentimes find that a lot of stuff gets unmasked after they have a concussion. And suddenly all this stuff comes to the surface. All of this stuff comes to the surface. Gets highlighted. People in later life, oftentimes, they, this stuff comes out, and they can't put it back, because the ability to put stuff back was really strong back as a kid. Kids can really dissociate easily. Adults, they don't have that ability as much. And so you end up getting flooded, which oftentimes pushes people out over here. And so the thing that oftentimes people come to see me about is actually burnout. Especially healthcare providers, and they're always telling me like, hey, I don't got any issues, my issue is just work. And I don't really want to deal with any of the stuff, because I think my issues are just I'm overworked and underpaid and not respected and appreciated in work, and that may all be very true. But the thing to remember is that the key catalyst of this that can really drive it forward is stress. When you add stress, and we'll understand this through a different thing, what you do is you turbocharge the need to cope. You turbocharge. And so you'll find that anybody who commits suicide usually has a stressor. Something bad happened that just flips it so that whatever they were doing to cope just isn't enough anymore. And then they go that route. And so we can understand this in a different paradigm that I like to use, because I like simple. I'm a simple person. So if we just kind of scroll down here, we use a different paradigm. So I like to use it and think of it as this. So we have these little teeter-totter things. So in a normal, or in a healthy sort of person, I think we'd all agree that there's stress. If we had a teeter-totter, people, like, who doesn't have stress, suffering, right, stuff? Maybe they even have a bit of stress. But they got a lot of resources. Strengths. And as long as strengths outweigh resources, outweigh the stuff, outweigh the stress, then you're kind of, content. Happy, right? Awful lot of people, though, are walking around in this scenario. Whereby their stuff and stress is outweighing the things inside of them, the internal and external strengths that they have. And this is suffering. And no human will suffer. Every suffering human will seek to cope, and if not coping is not a possibility, they will seek to commit suicide. And so a lot of people ask me, so why do I want to deal with the stuff? Well, the stuff is the stuff that you don't really realize is there, but it's there, right? Sometimes people are, they've pushed it out of their mind. It's kind of even invisible. So some people, they're in this state, and they go to a psychologist because they're not sure what's going on, but they're like this, Doctor, I don't know why I'm suffering. My resources are obviously greater than my stress, so why am I suffering? And after some therapy and some insight work, and they realize that, holy crow, there's a lot of stuff. It isn't just about the stress that they had. That is the straw that broke the camel's back. And so a lot of folks are in this scenario where they got their resources and they got their stuff and it's balanced. And that sounds nice, right? So we'll call this okay. But you know what? Add a little COVID to that situation. Add a little job loss. Add a little relationship difficulty, and all of a sudden, your S, plus a couple of other things that come on your plate, outweighs the R. And so really the only sustainable solution here that's gonna sort of help someone is this. If they are in this scenario where they've got a ton of stuff, right, and they got very few resources, they got two things they need to do, right? They gotta shrink, and in this order, they gotta increase the resources, right? Internal, external resources, to sort of create that balance point, and then they need to really work at carving this down so that it's manageable, so that they're perpetually in this state where they're light. They got a ton of resource, and they got, some stuff, but it's not too much. So even if they get a bit stressed out, even if some stuff happens, they're still in good shape. Or they're able to upregulate, add some yoga or some prayer or something, and quickly brings resources to bear. And the longer that you spend in this state, the more happier you are, the more content, the more serene. That's really what we're playing at, is we want to deal with the stuff, because the stuff is the stuff that is weighing you down, that's creating all of these resources. It takes a lot of energy to wall stuff off like that, and it's the thing that we can work on. But to do that, you need skills. You need healthy coping. You need people, places, and things. Same thing, people, places, and things that will help you with time digest the scars. And it is possible, and that's why we build a daily practice. That's why I call self-therapy because if you could spend time connecting to yourself every day, connecting to others, and committing to daily practice, you start dealing with your stuff. And as you start dealing with the stuff, it can't leak into the future, right? It stops leaking. And so you end up being able to focus on just what you need to focus on today. So that's a little bit about how I look at mental illness, coping, self-defeating habits, and all of these things, and how I find that they all tie together. And just keeping the eyes on the prize and the goal, just keeping the goal in mind, we are able to really have a solid why to accompany the what of recovery, and the where. And the where is oftentimes in the past. So I think we'll leave it at that for today. Again, begging forgiveness if I've misrepresented anything, and please do give me feedback if that is the case. And I wish you all the best, and we'll talk again next time. Bye now.